This is Tromelin Island, a place so barren that it was once simply known as the Isle of Sand. Today it stands as a chilling reminder of a horrifying episode in history, a story of abandonment, survival and death. In 1761, nearly 100 people, captured from their homeland, were left stranded here. Most of them never to be seen or heard from again. This is their story. It was the evening of July 31, 1761. Captain Jean de Lafargue stood at the helm of the French ship L'Utile, scanning the night sky as he wrestled with two conflicting maps. A man of experience, he knew the dangers of sailing in the Indian Ocean, particularly at night, with the ship's course veering far from the intended path. But what made this moment more treacherous was not the dark sky above him nor the turbulent sea surrounding the ship, but the maps in his hands, which had given him contradictory instructions on where to head next. Captain Jean wasn't just a ship captain. He was a man on a mission, one that had less to do with the cargo he was legally transporting and everything to do with something far more illicit. While his ship was indeed carrying a large shipment of beef and rice from Madagascar to the Isle of France, Captain Jean had a secret, much more profitable detour in mind. This detour would bring him to Rodriguez Island, a small, remote landmass in the Indian Ocean. Here, his true cargo, 160 Malagasy men, women and children, was to be sold, fetching an incredibly high price due to the ban on the slave trade in the French territories. The promise of a vast fortune loomed before him. However, instead of slowing down to recalibrate his position, Captain Jean made a critical decision: to push forward even at night. As L'Utile sailed onward, the wind began to whip around the ship, gusting at nearly 20 knots. The ocean was fierce and unpredictable, and yet, despite the mounting danger, Captain Jean refused to pause. He pressed forward through the dark, with only two inaccurate maps to guide him. It was during this reckless navigation that disaster struck. Hidden by the dark night and unprepared for the reef that lay in wait, L'Utile collided with it, sending a shock through the hull of the ship. The sound of cracking wood and the rush of water flooding into the ship was immediate. Within minutes, the vessel was sinking, its fate sealed by the destructive force of the Indian Ocean. The impact was devastating, and though Captain Jean and the majority of the crew managed to escape, the Malagasy passengers below deck, locked in the cargo hold, unable to free themselves, were not so fortunate. As the ship's hull was breached, the Malagasy passengers, whose fates had already been sealed by their forced capture, were swept away into the dark ocean waters, drowning in the chaos. As the wreckage of L'Utile splintered and sank beneath the waves, only 120 crew members and between 60 and 80 Malagasy survivors made it to the island, though many of them were severely injured or exhausted from the chaos of the shipwreck. When the first light of dawn finally broke over the horizon, the survivors saw their new reality, stranded on a tiny, desolate island with little hope of escape. The island they found themselves on was no sanctuary. Tromelin Island, then known as the Isle of Sand, was nothing more than a barren speck of land, about 300 miles northwest of Réunion Island and 280 miles east of Madagascar. The island was small, measuring only about a single square kilometer in area, and was devoid of any significant resources. Its highest point was a mere 23 feet above sea level, making it impossible to spot distant ships. There were no trees, no fresh water, and very few sources of food. Just a few scattered shrubs and grass, barely above knee height, could be seen. Its inhospitable terrain was made even worse by its lack of vegetation, which meant that any food the survivors could find would be incredibly limited. The island's location just south of the equator meant that temperatures during most of the year were sweltering, with the sun beating down relentlessly. While July and August provided a slight respite, the rest of the year brought intense heat, high winds, and violent tropical storms. The island's position also meant that there were no rainwater reservoirs or streams, and the survivors were forced to rely on what little water they could gather from the occasional rainfall. It became clear that they were not just stranded, they were stranded in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. Despite the dire circumstances, Captain Jean de Lafargue was too mentally shattered to lead. His illegal activities, the death of his crew, and the loss of the ship had taken a toll on him, causing his mental state to deteriorate rapidly. As his stress mounted, he began to lose his grip on reality, leading to a breakdown that forced his crew to relieve him of command. First Lieutenant Barthélemy Castellan du Vernet took over and assumed responsibility for organizing the survival efforts. Initially, the survivors salvaged what they could from the wreck. Wood, food, and items from the shipwreck washed up on the shore, giving the crew a slight advantage in their desperate fight for survival. Yet, despite the critical need for water, the survivors overlooked this basic necessity in the first days after the wreck. The Malagasy, still treated as subordinates, were given little attention or resources, even as they struggled to survive in their new harsh environment. The crew, focused solely on their own survival, failed to provide adequate rations for the Malagasy, leading to the deaths of 8 of them from dehydration within the first few days. When the surviving Malagasy began to pass away, it was clear that their situation was becoming increasingly dire. Only after the deaths of several did the new leader, Barthélemy, order the construction of a well. However, even then, the survival efforts were marred by the deep social divide between the French crew and the Malagasy. The crew built their camp on one end of the island, while the Malagasy were relegated to the other end, separated physically and emotionally from their captors. The divide between them remained even in the face of their shared predicament. Barthélemy's eventual decision to construct a ship from the wreckage of Lutile seemed to provide a glimmer of hope. On September 27, almost 2 months after the shipwreck, the survivors had completed the ship, which was named the Providence. Loaded with supplies, it set sail with the promise to return with help for the Malagasy left behind. However, after a long and difficult journey, the Providence arrived in Madagascar on October 1, 1761, but with grim news. The ship had encountered sickness and death during its voyage, including the death of Captain Jean. The crew was devastated, and Barthélemy found himself summoned by the French governor, who was furious about the shipwreck and its aftermath. In the following months, Barthélemy continued to press for a rescue of the stranded Malagasy, but the French government was embroiled in the 7 Years' War, and no ships could be spared to aid in the rescue. Despite Barthélemy's persistent efforts, the Malagasy remained stranded on Tromelin Island, abandoned by the French government and left to fend for themselves. Months turned into years and hope gradually faded. By 1772, the Malagasy survivors, who had once numbered around 60, had dwindled in number as sickness and malnutrition took their toll. Only 15 of the original group remained alive, their strength fading with each passing day. In 1775, after more than a decade of requests from Barthélemy, a ship was finally sent to Tromelin Island to rescue the survivors. But even this attempt would be doomed. The first ship to arrive near the island in 1775 reached the protective reef surrounding the island but was forced to turn back due to the dangers posed by the jagged rocks. A second attempt in 1776 was met with a similar fate. This time, a small rowboat was dispatched to the island. However, a violent storm blew in, shattering the boat and tossing 2 of the sailors into the sea. One of the sailors swam back to the ship, while the other managed to reach the island. But instead of a rescue, the ship abandoned him, leaving him stranded on the island with the remaining Malagasy. Desperate, the Malagasy built yet another raft, this time using the feathers of seabirds for a sail. In the early months of 1777, 7 Malagasy and the stranded French sailors set off on the raft, hoping to reach another island and find help. Tragically, they were never seen again. The survivors on Tromelin Island were left to endure their solitude. As the years stretched on, Tromelin Island became a silent witness to the suffering of its human inhabitants, captured people, abandoned and forgotten. It was not until 1777, 16 years after the wreck of Lutile, that a final attempt to rescue the Malagasy was made. But by then only a few remained. The survivors' ordeal, which had begun with the brutal shipwreck in 1761, would become one of the most haunting and tragic tales of human endurance in history. The fate of those left behind on Tromelin Island is one of humanity's darkest chapters, a story of cruelty, abandonment, and survival against all odds. The survivors were eventually rescued, but only a handful remained to tell their tale. The rest, lost to time, are remembered only by the bones they left behind in the sand. In the end, the island's haunting name, the Isle of Sand, became an eternal symbol of the suffering that took place there. If you found this story intriguing and want to explore more in-depth historical events like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about these forgotten and chilling tales? See you in the next video.